All right, so World War I, right? Everyone thinks they know it, but then you dig a little deeper and you realize, whoa, there's a whole other side to this story.
Definitely. And it's the side that often gets overshadowed, even forgotten.
Exactly. And that's where Eugene Rogan's book, The Fall of the Ottomans, comes in. You brought this to our attention, and let me tell you, it's a game changer.
It really is. Rogan does a phenomenal job of shifting our focus away from that traditional Western Front narrative and showing just how central the Ottoman Empire was to the entire conflict.
It's like we've been looking at a postcard of the Grand Canyon when there's this whole other, vast landscape out there. We get so caught up in the trenches of Europe, but then Rogan throws open the doors to this whole other theater of war. Deserts in Arabia, mountains in the Caucasus.
And it broadens the scope of the entire war. Suddenly, we aren't just talking about, some border dispute in Europe. We're talking about the Suez Canal.
The lifeline of the British Empire.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The Suez Canal being threatened, the oil fields of Mesopotamia.
So valuable, even back then.
Oh, absolutely, and even more so today. And then there's Jerusalem, right in the thick of it all.
One of the holiest cities in the world, caught up in this global conflict. It's mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It really is.
And Rogan really drives home the point that this wasn't some, sideshow to the real war happening in Europe. This was a global conflict with global consequences.
And he highlights that so well through these individual stories he brings in. You read about Scottish Corporal John
The
MacDonald.
one who died at Gallipoli, yeah, that got to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Scottish soldier fighting in Gallipoli. It just goes to show you how far-reaching this conflict was.
Exactly. And it hits close to home, right?
Right.
Because without that Ottoman front, without Gallipoli, MacDonald's family doesn't emigrate to the United States. Who knows where your family history would have led? It makes you think.
It really does. These ripple effects, they spread further than we can even imagine. But it also begs the question, why would the Ottomans, an empire already on shaky ground, willingly jump into this?
It's a great question, and it's where Rogan really digs deep into the motivations of the Young Turks, the Ottoman leadership.
Hmm.
And it's not as straightforward as you might think.
So walk us through it. What was the strategy? What were they thinking?
Well, get this. They actually considered siding with Russia.
Russia, you're kidding. Why on earth would they even entertain that idea?
It just shows how much they were weighing their options. They were desperate to preserve what was left of their empire and saw Germany, at that time, as the lesser of two evils.
So a calculated risk, but a huge gamble nonetheless.
Absolutely.
And speaking of gambles, what about this whole jihad made in Germany idea? I mean, that sounds like something out of a movie.
Right. It's a fascinating, albeit complex, aspect of the war. Essentially, the Ottomans, under the Young Turks' leadership, attempted to rally support not just within their own borders but across the entire Muslim world by invoking the idea of a holy war.
But how do you even begin to unite such a diverse population from North Africa to India under one banner, especially when many of these individuals are already part of other empires?
It was no easy feat. Rogan talks about these Indian soldiers, for example, fighting for the British, who were captured by the Germans, and it's through their interactions with the Germans that they're exposed to this Ottoman call for jihad. And get this, some of them actually switched sides.
Wow, talk about a twist. That's incredible, and it really highlights the power dynamics at play during the war, but also the very real influence of religion and identity.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to the narrative, forcing us to consider how various communities, different cultures, experience the war based on their own unique set of circumstances.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always as black and white as we tend to think, is it?
Not at all.
And speaking of complexities, the Ottomans weren't just, sitting back hoping this jihad would win the war for them. They were engaged in some truly brutal fighting, and Gallipoli stands out as a major turning point.
Absolutely. Gallipoli is fascinating because it really flips the script on how we typically view World War I.
Thus,
Well, we often focus on it as this tragic Allied defeat, right? But for the Ottomans, it was a massive victory, orchestrated by none other than Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey.
it's like a whole other narrative unfolding alongside the one we thought we knew.
Precisely. But even with the victory at Gallipoli, Rogan doesn't shy away from the realities of war.
He doesn't sugarcoat it.
He doesn't. He paints a very raw and honest picture of what it was like on the ground, the relentless shelling, the disease, the psychological toll it took on soldiers from both sides. It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of war, regardless of who ultimately claims victory.
And it makes the next chapter of the story even more difficult to process: the Armenian genocide.
It's a dark period, no doubt. And it unfolded concurrently with those very military campaigns we were just discussing, the systematic deportation and killing of Ottoman Armenians. Rogan confronts this horrific reality head-on.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. He brings in eyewitness accounts, historical evidence, and really lays out the responsibility of the Young Turk regime.
It's a heavy topic, without a doubt, and it's a stark reminder that even in the midst of a global war, these acts of calculated cruelty deserve our attention, our remembrance, and our understanding.
It's a part of the story that we can't afford to ignore. And as challenging as it is to confront, we must remember that these events didn't happen in a vacuum. They were directly intertwined with the larger narrative of World War I, with its power struggles, its shifting alliances, and its nationalist tensions. And it was against this backdrop of escalating violence and shifting alliances that the war really started to heat up across multiple fronts. Rogan takes us through these final years, showing how the Ottoman front played out from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Caucasus. And believe me, it's a whirlwind.
Okay, so walk me through it. Where do things go from here?
Well, let's look at the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Shaiba in Mesopotamia in April 1915, for example. It wasn't just a loss on the battlefield, though. It set off this, chain reaction.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Iraqi recruits in the Ottoman army, they started deserting, and not just a handful here and there. We're talking mass desertion, which obviously significantly weakened their forces in the region.
So it wasn't just external enemies they had to worry about, but unrest within their own ranks?
Exactly, and it wasn't just the soldiers either. In May 1915, the city of Najaf, a holy city for Shia Muslims, revolted against Ottoman rule. Talk about a sign.
Yeah, their grip on power was definitely slipping. The war just seemed to exacerbate all of these internal tensions that were already simmering below the surface.
Absolutely, and all of this is happening while the British are really turning up the pressure, especially down in Mesopotamia, where they've got their eyes on a very specific prize.
Those oil fields.
Exactly. And this whole Mesopotamian campaign, it reads like something out of an adventure novel. I mean, you've got these daring maneuvers, surprise attacks, crushing defeats. It's hard to keep track of who's winning and losing from one minute to the next.
That's war for you, right? One minute you're on top, the next you're fighting just to hold on to what you've got.
Exactly. And the Siege of Kut is a perfect example of that back and forth struggle.
Ah, yes, Kut. That was where the British were trapped for months, right? A major blow to their forces.
It was a turning point in the Mesopotamian campaign, that's for sure. It exposed the brutal realities of waging war in that kind of environment. Supply lines stretched thin, communication a nightmare, and the human cost on both sides incredibly high.
I can't even begin to imagine the desperation those soldiers trapped in Kut must have felt, just clinging to this hope of relief that never came.
Rogan does a really good job of bringing in those human elements. He weaves in these personal accounts, diary entries that give you a glimpse into what it was actually like to be there. The dwindling rations, the constant fear, it's powerful stuff.
It's a good reminder that even in these massive military campaigns, with all the grand strategies and political maneuvering, it's still those individuals on the ground who bear the true cost of war.
Couldn't agree more.
So we've got this brutal fight for survival happening in Mesopotamia, but meanwhile, on the Arabian Peninsula, another front is opening up. The Arab Revolt, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca.
Right, and this is where T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, enters the picture.
I mean, you can't talk about the Arab Revolt without mentioning him.
Oh, absolutely. Lawrence played a significant role, no doubt. But it's important to remember that the Arab Revolt was much bigger than any one person. It was this complex movement fueled by this deep desire for Arab independence from Ottoman rule.
And I imagine there were internal divisions even within the revolt itself.
Of course. The Arab world wasn't this monolithic bloc. Different tribes, different leaders, each with their own agendas, their own rivalries. Some wanted a clean break from the Ottomans, while others envisioned a more gradual transition. Navigating that web of alliances and rivalries was no easy task.
Especially with the British pulling strings in the background. Weren't they making all sorts of promises to the Arabs during this time? Promises that, didn't exactly pan out the way many had hoped?
They did. And those promises, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, would have huge implications down the line. This secret pact between Britain and France, they basically carved up the Ottoman territories between them.
Right, talk about a recipe for future conflict. But for now, let's get back to the Arab Revolt. How did this alliance between the Hashemites, led by Sharif Hussein, and the British actually play out on the ground?
It was this whirlwind of strategic raids and daring maneuvers, all aimed at wearing down the Ottoman forces. And the capture of Aqaba, a strategic port city on the Red Sea. That was a major turning point.
Why was Aqaba so important?
Well, for one, it provided a crucial supply line for the Arab forces, which allowed them to expand their operations northward into Syria.
So a huge strategic victory, but I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing.
You're right, they faced setbacks too, like at the Battle of Mayan in April 1918.
Yeah.
It showed that the Ottomans, even with their empire crumbling around them, were not to be underestimated.
And those kinds of setbacks probably didn't help with maintaining that sense of unity within the revolt itself. Defeats have a way of exposing those cracks.
Definitely. And while all of this was happening down in Arabia up north, the British were launching a major offensive in Palestine led by General Edmund Allenby.
Allenby, the one who would eventually take Jerusalem. Talk about a pivotal moment in history.
It was. Allenby was, he was brilliant, ruthless. He transformed the Egyptian Expeditionary Force into a true fighting machine, equipping them with the latest technology.
Like what? Give us the details.
Well, like tanks, for instance. Tanks were brand new at this point, and they made their debut on the Ottoman front.
Tanks in the desert? That's incredible. Talk about a game changer.
Totally. Allenby used those tanks to devastating effect, smashing through Ottoman lines at the Battle of Beersheba in October 1917. That victory paved the way for the capture of Jerusalem just 2 months later.
Wow. December 1917, a date etched in history. What a symbolic victory for the British, and what a blow to the Ottomans.
Absolutely. It really signaled the beginning of the end of Ottoman rule in the region.
But even with all of this happening, the war wasn't over yet, right? There were still battles raging elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. While the British were making gains in Palestine, another crucial campaign was unfolding in the Caucasus, and this one was all about control of Baku,
Baku.
a strategically vital city swimming in oil.
Of course, the oil fields. It seems like oil was a recurring theme throughout this war.
It certainly was a factor, and the
Yeah.
Caucasus is often overlooked, when we think about World War I.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly significant.
Sure.
You had the Ottomans, the Russians, the Armenians, the Azerbaijanis, all vying for control of this region.
Sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It was a brutal conflict, that's for sure,
Yeah.
fueled by nationalist ambitions and, of course, the desire to control those oil riches. And it highlights how interconnected this world war truly was. Well, think about it. These weren't just separate, self-contained conflicts happening in different parts of the world. What happened in the Caucasus could have ripple effects in Palestine and vice versa. Decisions made in London or Berlin could have life or death consequences for soldiers on the ground in Mesopotamia. It was all connected.
It really drives home the point that this wasn't just some European squabble. It was a truly global conflict with global consequences. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, just how much was happening at the same time in all these different corners of the world. It really makes you question those, neat little narratives we often try to impose on history, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows how everything was connected in this truly global war. And the thing is, those connections, they didn't just disappear when the fighting stopped.
You're talking about the aftermath, right? The way the Middle East was reshaped. Because Rogan really emphasizes that the decisions made back then still have a huge impact today.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire was broken up, carved up by the victors. It created this vacuum that Britain and France were, they were all too eager to fill. And they did it in a way that often disregarded the existing realities on the ground. I mean, they were drawing borders, installing governments, often with little regard for the people who actually lived in those places.
And that's where we see the seeds of so much future conflict being sown.
Exactly. Take the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example. The Balfour Declaration, this promise made by the British government in 1917 to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, that was a key factor.
A promise made during the war that would have repercussions for decades to come.
It's a classic example of how actions taken during wartime, often in the heat of the moment with an eye on victory, can have these long-lasting ripple effects. And it wasn't just Palestine. This whole redrawing of the map, the creation of new states like Iraq, Syria, often with borders that made little sense.
Dividing communities, grouping together those with long-standing rivalries.
Exactly. So instead of, peace and stability, the end of the war kind of ushered in this whole new era of problems and tensions.
A whole new set of struggles for power. And it wasn't just the Arabs and the Jews who were impacted. What about the Kurds? They got caught in the middle of all of this too, didn't they?
They did. The Kurds, who had hoped for an independent Kurdistan, saw their aspirations dashed as the victors drew borders that divided their traditional homeland. And that struggle for self-determination, It's something that continues even to this day.
It really goes to show you that the end of World War One, it wasn't really the end, at least not for the Middle East. It was just the beginning of a whole new chapter.
It's like one chapter ends and another, even more complicated one begins.
And that's why understanding the Ottoman experience in World War One is so crucial, right? Because it provides that missing context, the background, the why behind so much of what we see happening in the Middle East today.
It's like Rogan is saying, you can't understand the present if you don't understand the past. And he doesn't shy away from any of it. You know, the complexities, the tragedies, those uncomfortable truths, it's all there.
It's definitely a lot to process, but it's important nonetheless.
It is. And he leaves us with this really thought-provoking question. What if the Ottomans had remained neutral? What if that one decision had gone a different way? Would it have been a shorter war, less devastating? Would the Middle East look different today?
So many what ifs. It's impossible to know for sure, but it certainly gets you thinking about the course of history, the choices made, the unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles and treaties. It's about people and the choices they make and how those choices reverberate through time.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to ponder today, a whole new lens through which to view World War One. If you're looking for a fresh perspective on this conflict, a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped the Middle East, then Eugene Rogan's The Fall of the Ottomans is a must-read. It's a journey into a forgotten front of the Great War, a front that, as we've seen today, continues to resonate even now in the 21st century.